The tension in the studio was unbearable. Every seat was filled, yet the room felt strangely silent, as if the audience itself was holding its breath. On one side of the debate sat Graham Mitchell, the sharp-tongued, coldly logical host of the Hardline. He was famous not for discussing faith, but for dismantling it. His guests, whether pastors, theologians, or politicians, often left his show feeling exposed, outmaneuvered, or outright humiliated. And tonight he had been given a golden opportunity. Seated across from him, composed and unreadable, was Barron Trump. Unlike Mitchell's usual guests, Barron was not a pastor. He was not a politician. He was not a scholar of theology. He was simply a young man who had agreed to sit in that chair, in that moment, knowing exactly what he was walking into. Mitchell, sensing an easy victory, leaned forward. His lips curled into a smirk, the same smirk he had worn countless times before, the one that signaled he was about to tear apart his opponent, piece by piece. He cleared his throat and spoke, his voice slow and deliberate. "Faith," he said, letting the word settle into the air. "Faith is a psychological crutch. It is something people rely on when they are too afraid to face reality." A few soft chuckles rippled through the audience. Mitchell had played this game before, and he had always won. "You have had access to the best education," he continued, his voice heavy with condescension. "You have studied science, philosophy, logic, and yet you still believe in God?" His smirk widened, his eyes narrowing. "Tell me, Barron," he said, his tone dripping with amusement. "Do you really believe in this, God? Or is it simply something your father passed down to you, like his name and fortune? A perfectly crafted trap?" The audience stirred, waiting for Barron to flinch, to stumble, to hesitate. But Barron did not flinch, he did not shift, he did not even blink. Instead, he met Mitchell's gaze, calm and unwavering. And then, in a voice steady as stone, he answered. "You assume faith is inherited," he said, "that it is something passed down like an heirloom, but faith is not wealth, it is not power, it is a choice." A ripple of murmurs spread through the audience. Even Mitchell's smirk flickered, just for a second. Because in that moment, everyone in the room realized something. This debate was not going to go the way Mitchell had planned. For a brief moment, Graham Mitchell did not speak. The usual rhythm of his debates, his guest fumbling for an answer, the audience chuckling at their struggle, was missing. Instead, there was silence. A silence that stretched just long enough to make the audience shift in their seats. Just long enough for the cameras to capture the faint flicker of uncertainty in Mitchell's eyes. But he recovered quickly. With a slow, deliberate shake of his head, Mitchell exhaled sharply, forcing a smile onto his face. "Faith is a choice," he repeated, letting out a dry chuckle. "All right, let us go with that." He turned slightly, gesturing toward the audience. "People choose to believe in all kinds of things, ghosts, luck, magic. People choose to believe in things that comfort them, things that make them feel safe. That does not make them real." The audience reacted this time, a few quiet laughs slipping through. Mitchell saw his opening and leaned into it. "You are young, Barron," he continued, his voice smooth, practiced. "You have grown up in privilege. You have never faced real hardship. You have never had to rely on faith the way others have. Tell me, if you had been raised differently in a different home, under different circumstances, do you honestly think you would still believe?" A familiar argument, a cornering tactic. Barron remained still, his expression unreadable. But when he spoke, his voice was clear and steady. "You assume that because I have not suffered, I do not understand faith," he said. "But tell me, Graham, what about you?" Mitchell's smirk did not disappear, but his posture shifted ever so slightly. Barron leaned forward just a fraction, his blue eyes steady. You say faith is a crutch, he continued. But I wonder, have you ever truly needed one? A new kind of silence fell over the studio. The audience did not laugh this time. Mitchell paused, his tongue pressing against his cheek, as if deciding whether to dismiss the question or engage. But Barron was not done. I have met people who hold on to faith because they have been through something. They have lost. They have suffered. And in that suffering they found something greater than themselves. They did not turn to faith because they were weak. They turned to faith because they needed strength. A woman in the front row dabbed at her eyes. Mitchell straightened in his seat, his smile fading just slightly. You believe suffering proves God exists? He asked, his voice quieter now. Barron shook his head. No, he said. But I believe the way people endure suffering does. A sharp intake of breath rippled through the audience. Mitchell's expression changed just for a moment, because everyone in the room knew his story, his wife, the accident, the night that had changed his life forever. And for the first time, Graham Mitchell had no words. The silence in the studio was different now. It was no longer the controlled pause of a seasoned host, the kind that built tension before delivering a final blow. No, this silence was unsettling. Graham Mitchell, the man who had made a career out of dismantling faith with sharp logic and calculated arguments, was hesitating. He cleared his throat, shifting slightly in his seat. The audience watched, waiting for him to regain control. But he was not just debating any guest tonight. He was debating someone who was not playing his game. That is an interesting way to put it, Mitchell finally said, his voice more measured now. But suffering does not prove anything, Barron. It is just pain. It does not mean there is a God. It just means life is unfair. Barron's expression did not change. Then tell me something, Graham, he said, his voice calm but firm. Have you ever lost someone you truly loved? The words hit the room like a thunderclap. The audience shifted. A few people in the front row exchanged uneasy glances. Mitchell stiffened. His jaw tightened just slightly, but it was enough for those paying attention to see the crack in his armor. Because everyone knew his story. His wife, the accident, the night that had rewritten the course of his life. For a fleeting second, Mitchell's eyes flickered. Not with anger, but with something deeper. Pain. He let out a slow breath, trying to regain his footing. That is personal, he said, his voice quieter now. It is, Barron agreed. But you asked me why I believe, and I am asking you, what did you believe before? Mitchell blinked. It was a question he had not expected. He had spent years tearing apart the beliefs of others, but never had anyone turned the question back on him. Never had anyone forced him to remember. He opened his mouth, to deflect, to dismiss, to say something clever. But nothing came out. The studio remained dead silent. Even the camera operators had stopped moving, as if the entire room was waiting for an answer. A single tear glistened at the corner of a woman's eye in the front row. She was not the only one. Because in that moment, the debate was no longer about faith, it was about loss. About what comes after. And for the first time in his career, Graham Mitchell had no argument to give. For the first time in his career, Graham Mitchell had no answer. The confident host, the man who had spent years exposing the so-called weakness of faith, sat frozen, his mind reaching for words that refused to come. The audience felt it. This was no longer a debate. It was something raw, personal, undeniable. Barron did not press. He did not smirk. He did not celebrate the silence like his opponent would have. He simply waited. Mitchell blinked hard, exhaling through his nose. His fingers tightened around the edge of the table, his usual composure cracking at the edges. I believed once, he finally admitted, his voice lower, slower. The audience stilled. When my wife was alive, I believed. A hushed wave of emotion rippled through the crowd. Even those who had come expecting another takedown could not ignore the shift. Mitchell let out a sharp breath, as if angry at himself for saying it out loud. "I prayed," he continued, "when she was in the hospital. I sat beside her bed and begged. I made promises to a God I thought was listening." His voice tightened. "And then she died anyway." A few people in the audience gasped softly. Others looked down, unable to meet his eyes. "Tell me, Barron," Mitchell said, forcing a chuckle that did not match the pain in his face. "What kind of God lets that happen?" It was not an attack anymore. It was a confession. Barron inhaled, slow and steady. He did not respond right away. He let the weight of the words settle. Then he leaned forward slightly, his voice calm but filled with something deeper. Understanding. "You think that because you lost her, it means God was never there," he said gently. "But I wonder, what if you only looked for him in the outcome, and not in the moments before?" Mitchell's head tilted slightly. "What are you saying?" Barron did not look away. "You prayed beside her, Graham," he said. "You sat there, holding her hand, hoping, believing, even if just for a moment, that something greater was listening." A tear slipped down the cheek of a woman in the second row. "You only call it foolish because she did not survive," Barron continued. "But tell me, was there no meaning in those moments? Was there no love? Was there no strength in you that was not there before?" Mitchell stared at him, his breath coming in slow, uneven intervals. He was not used to being the one forced to reflect. "Faith is not about getting what you want," Barron said. "It is about never being alone in what you face." The air in the studio grew thick, heavy, and for the first time in his life, Graham Mitchell did not seem so sure that he had been alone after all. For the first time, Graham Mitchell was not arguing. He was listening. The audience could feel it. The shift in the air, the breaking of something unseen. The hardened, skeptical host who had spent years challenging faith was no longer challenging. He was remembering. His wife, the hospital room, the beeping machines, the sterile scent of antiseptic in the air, and the prayers. Prayers he had buried deep, locked away, convinced they had been unanswered. But now, in front of thousands watching, Barron Trump had asked him something no one else ever had. Was there no meaning in those moments? Mitchell's throat tightened. His jaw clenched. He was fighting it, the emotion, the memories, the truth he had ignored for so long. He tried to push back. "So, what are you saying, Barron?" he asked, his voice not as sharp as before. "That even though she died, I was not alone? That God was there, just watching?" Barron shook his head. "Not watching," he said softly. "Holding." A woman in the front row gasped quietly. "Holding what?" Mitchell asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Barron met his gaze, unshaken. "You." The words landed like a weight in the room, pressing against something deep inside everyone listening. Mitchell swallowed hard. He looked down at his hands, almost as if seeing them for the first time. Barron let the silence stretch before continuing. "You think because she died, your prayers were unanswered. But maybe you are still here because they were." Mitchell's head snapped up. "What do you mean?" Barron leaned in slightly. "What did you do after she died?" he asked. "Did you stop? Did you give up? Or did you keep going even when it hurt?" Mitchell's eyes flickered. "I kept going," he admitted, his voice barely holding. "Why?" Mitchell exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. "Because I had to." Barron nodded. "Because something inside you told you to," he said. "Something kept you moving forward, even when everything told you to stop. You call it instinct, resilience. But I have met people who call it something else." Mitchell's lips parted, but no words came out. "Grace," Barron said. The room went completely still. The audience, once divided between believers and skeptics, now sat as one, caught in a moment neither side had expected. Graham Mitchell, the man who had torn apart faith for a living, was staring at Barron Trump as if seeing something he had never considered before. Something he was not ready to admit. Something he could no longer deny. The studio felt different now. The cold, calculated atmosphere of a debate had faded. In its place was something deeper, something raw. The audience, once leaning forward in anticipation of a fight, now sat motionless, caught in the gravity of the moment. And at the center of it, Graham Mitchell sat with his hands clasped together, his gaze distant. His chest rose and fell in slow, measured breaths. His face, once hardened by years of dismissing faith, was softer now, as if something inside him had cracked open. Barron Trump watched him carefully, not pressing, not gloating, just waiting. Mitchell finally looked up, his eyes glistening under the stage lights. "I have spent my whole life saying that faith is an illusion," he admitted, his voice uncharacteristically unsteady, "that it is nothing but a story we tell ourselves to cope." He paused, his fingers pressing against the edge of the desk. "But sitting here, listening to you," he let out a slow breath, shaking his head slightly, "I am starting to wonder if I have been running from something all these years." A few gasps rippled through the audience. Some people wiped their eyes. Others sat frozen, stunned by what was happening. Barron's expression remained gentle, unwavering. "Maybe you have," he said quietly, "or maybe you've just been waiting for the right moment to stop." Mitchell let out a soft, broken chuckle, shaking his head again. For the first time, he had no argument left to give. The cameras zoomed in, capturing every detail, the slight tremble in Mitchell's fingers, the way he exhaled like someone realizing a weight had been on his shoulders for years. The audience, filled with people who had come expecting another takedown, now sat in stunned silence, because no one had expected this. A tear slipped down Mitchell's cheek. The man who had built a career mocking faith had just experienced something he could not explain. Barron did not push further. He simply nodded, his voice calm as he said, "Sometimes, Graham, the hardest part of faith is allowing yourself to feel it." The host's throat bobbed as he swallowed. He let out a small, unsteady breath and turned to the cameras. For the first time in his career, he did not have a closing argument. Instead, he had a question. "We will be right back," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. The screen faded to black, but the moment did not end there. Because in the days that followed, millions of people watched, shared, and discussed what had just happened on live television. And as the headlines rolled in, one thing became clear. Barron Trump had not just won a debate. He had changed something far greater. This was not just a debate. It was a moment that forced us to confront something deeper, something beyond words, beyond arguments, beyond logic alone. What happened here tonight was not about winning or losing. It was about truth, about the questions we avoid, and about the answers we fear might change us. If this conversation moved you, even for a second, then it is time to ask yourself, what do you believe? And more importantly, why? We live in a world where faith is often dismissed, where belief is seen as weakness, and where conviction is ridiculed. But perhaps, in the quiet moments of doubt, faith is not the absence of reason. It is the presence of something greater than ourselves. If this story challenged you, share it. If it spoke to something inside you, reflect on it. But above all, do not walk away unchanged. Because the most powerful questions are the ones that leave us restless. And sometimes they are the ones that lead us home. Subscribe to this channel for more thought-provoking stories. Turn on notifications because the conversations that truly matter are just beginning.